Most modern discussions of survival, well, they tend to reduce food to numbers, calories in, calories out, protein targets, shelf life in months or years. Before industrial agriculture narrowed diets to just a handful of staple grains, communities actually relied on really diverse landscapes for micronutrients, seasonal variation, and medicinal plants. This was not primitive improvisation. It was structured, intergenerational knowledge. People knew which spring greens replenished bodies after winter, which tree barks yielded vitamin-rich teas, which roots stored well underground, and which berries signaled particular soil and water conditions. In northern Europe, early spring foraging of nettles, sorrel, and wild garlic was not merely culinary preference. It compensated for the micronutrient deficiencies of winter grain stores. In many indigenous North American societies, seasonal rounds were carefully timed migrations that integrated fishing, hunting, and plant gathering to maintain dietary balance. These systems produced resilience because they were diversified. No single crop failure meant total collapse. The shift toward monoculture agriculture and centralized provisioning did increase population capacity, but it also created nutritional bottlenecks. The reliance on grain-heavy diets without adequate fresh supplementation made populations vulnerable to deficiency diseases. Armies repeatedly relearned that lesson the hard way. Military logistics in the early modern periods often reveal the tension between centralized supply and local knowledge. Armies that relied exclusively on stored rations suffered predictable health crises. Scurvy is the most famous example, often associated with naval voyages, but similar deficiencies plagued land campaigns when fresh food was absent. During long campaigns in forested regions of North America, European forces initially struggled because their ration systems were rigid and grain-centered. Indigenous allies frequently demonstrated how local plants and fresh game could supplement salt pork and hardtack. Units that adapted fared better in endurance and mobility. In the Napoleonic Wars, vast armies moving through Eastern Europe stripped regions of grain and livestock. When supply chains faltered, soldiers resorted to uncontrolled scavenging. But this was not disciplined foraging grounded in ecological knowledge. It was caloric desperation. The difference mattered. Troops unfamiliar with local flora consumed inadequate or unsafe substitutes, worsening illness and attrition. The same pattern appeared in 20th century conflicts. In the Pacific Theater during World War II, Japanese forces cut off from supply lines sometimes survived for years by turning to jungle resources. Those who had prior training in local plant identification and fishing techniques endured longer. Others, lacking that knowledge, succumbed to malnutrition despite abundant vegetation around them. Jungle did not equal nourishment. Knowledge did. Industrial war narrowed diets in ways that weakened soldiers over time. Mass mobilization in the 20th century required standardized rations. Canned goods, processed meats, refined flour products, these were triumphs of preservation and logistics. They allowed armies to move quickly and feed millions. But they also simplified diets dramatically. By World War I, soldiers on both sides of the Western Front consumed calorie-dense but monotonous rations. Fresh produce was scarce in trench conditions. Vitamin deficiencies, though less dramatic than scurvy of earlier centuries, contributed to fatigue and susceptibility to illness. Military medicine gradually recognized that calories alone were insufficient. Supplementation programs emerged not from abstract nutrition science, but from observing the consequences of narrow diets under stress. During World War II, some resistance groups in occupied territories depended heavily on foraging to supplement limited supplies. In parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans, partisan units survived winters by integrating forest foods, mushrooms, berries, wild greens into their rations. This was not romantic subsistence. It was strategic adaptation. Those who knew the land could operate with lighter logistical footprints, evade detection, and remain active longer than occupying forces expected. The historical record suggests that resilience does not come from abandoning agriculture. It comes from layering systems, cultivation combined with wild supplementation, storage combined with seasonal gathering. Foraging provided micronutrients and medicinal support that stored rations simply could not. One often overlooked dimension of ancestral foraging is, well, its medicinal function. Many wild plants, were valued just as much for maintaining health as for their caloric contribution. Willow bark, for example, was used for pain relief. Pine needle teas were rich in vitamin C, and fermented wild greens supported gut health long before microbiology could even explain why. During prolonged military campaigns, small nutritional deficiencies really start to accumulate. Fatigue increases, wound healing slows, morale declines. Historical accounts from frontier settlements and guerrilla movements frequently note the restorative effect of fresh greens after months of preserved food. The caloric difference was, honestly, pretty modest, but the micronutrient difference was significant. Modern preparedness discussions often emphasize bulk staples: rice, beans, flour. These are rational foundations, for sure. But historical experience suggests that without micronutrient diversity, long-term resilience erodes. Ancestral foraging filled that gap. There is a difference between desperation and disciplined ecological literacy. It is important to, separate romanticism from realism. Foraging is not effortless abundance. It actually requires training, caution, and seasonal awareness. Many historical famines demonstrate that wild foods alone simply cannot sustain dense populations indefinitely. However, the presence of structured knowledge made the difference between controlled supplementation and hazardous guesswork. Communities that maintained plant identification skills, preservation techniques, and ecological mapping could stretch supplies safely. Those who had lost that knowledge were, more vulnerable when conventional systems failed. In several 20th century sieges, civilians turned to urban foraging: parks, riverbanks, abandoned lots. Survival rates often correlated with prior rural experience. People who recognized edible weeds or knew how to prepare unfamiliar plants reduced risk and improved nutritional intake. Again, calories were only part of the equation. Correct preparation prevented toxicity and preserved limited energy. Modern survivalism sometimes focuses heavily on equipment and stored goods, but history suggests that knowledge, portable, renewable, and adaptable, may be equally critical. The ancestral art of foraging is not, a call to abandon modern systems. It's a reminder that resilience has always been layered. Agriculture provides scale, storage provides stability, foraging provides diversity and adaptability. In an era of climate uncertainty and geopolitical tension, supply disruptions are no longer just theoretical. They are recurring features of global life. The lesson from centuries of conflict and hardship is consistent. Communities that understand their local environments suffer less when centralized systems falter. Foraging also reconnects people to seasonal cycles that industrial life, honestly, has obscured. That awareness sharpens observation of soil conditions, water sources, plant health, and animal patterns. Historically, such awareness had military value, economic value, and health value. When armies ignored local ecological knowledge, they paid in illness and attrition. When resistance groups mastered it, they extended their operational capacity. When civilian populations retained it, they buffered themselves against scarcity. Remembering this lost nutritional wisdom is not nostalgia. It is practical historical insight. At its core, foraging represents a relationship with land built on attention and restraint. It requires knowing when to harvest and when to leave growth undisturbed. It assumes that survival is not extracted in a single season, but sustained across generations. Industrial systems excel at scale and efficiency, but they struggle with fragility and overextension. Ancestral systems excelled at diversification and local adaptation. The most resilient societies really blended both. When we reduce food to calories, we overlook the broader architecture of endurance that sustained communities through war, migration, and environmental stress. Foraging was one strand in that architecture, quiet, often invisible, but decisive when margins narrowed. Understanding these overlooked histories matters because they reveal patterns that repeat. Supply lines fail, climates shift, conflicts disrupt trade. In those moments, the societies that endure are not always the most technologically advanced. They are the ones that remember how to adapt. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis, where we look beyond surface narratives and recover the lessons buried in lived experience, subscribe to the Prepper Historian and share this video with others who take history and preparedness seriously.